Please welcome to the stage Peter Mayer and Peter Miner.
Hello, everybody. My name is Peter. I'm one of the co-founders of Absolute Climate. We're building universal standards that apply to all carbon removal. So DAC should be treated the same way that we do bikers or enhanced rock weathering. And one of the reasons that we work on this is not just because of this big question of what is CDR and how do you think about how we measure whether climate impacts are real, but the intersection of MRV and liability in contracts and in offtake agreements. And so I feel very fortunate to be joined by another Peter Mayer here, who's been really deep on this topic for a long time. And so I expected this would be like a very esoteric conversation, but I actually, luckily, Brian DiMarino brought up this question of liability even before us. So Brian, if you're here, we need to have words after this. But Peter has been involved in not just thinking through how do you actually write and build offtake agreements for startups, but has been working with NREL on a universal offtake agreement that can be used across different types of parties, and thinking through how do you standardize even those type of legal agreements, and have been involved in just the general conversation of what is the intersection of standardization of MRV and the legal side. And so, yeah, Peter, excited to be here with you. And I think the first question I kind of wanted to ask was, what is it? Like, there's been these conversations of like, why does MRV matter? Is it going to just be this drawback on the industry and slow us down? Like, why do we do standards? What's the purpose from a legal perspective?
Right, thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Yeah, I mean, standards are really important in the sense of, what is a buyer actually buying? An offtake agreement is basically, it's a purchase agreement, and like in any other purchase agreement, a buyer would like to understand what kind of asset he is getting for the money he is paying. So MRV really plays a very important role in defining what is a carbon credit in terms of CO2 removed. How do we measure that? Is it a ton? And there are different kinds of methodologies out there, which are obviously can be extremely, and are actually very confusing for buyers, especially for first-time buyers that are teetering on the fence and are wondering if they should jump into the pool or not. So, and buyers always think that they are overburdened with the risk, right? So at one point, they may have the risk of their emissions, but then we were just talking about this backstage. They don't want to trade this sort of with the risk of purchasing fake credits or credits that don't meet up to the promise that are, that they're underwritten with. So MRV and standards are incredibly important to bring transparency and credibility into this market. And contracts are then sort of the next step because they can provide for remedies if a certain standard doesn't live up to the expectations. So they go both hand in hand. MRV, legal standards, liabilities, and claims are all interconnected and are extremely important to demystify risk for buyers that want to enter this market. I mean, Frontier, obviously, they have due diligence teams. They are sophisticated when it comes to these kinds of transactions, but many buyers are not, and especially potential buyers are not. And so when we are talking about how can we develop this market further, we need to find a way to demystify the risk for buyers. And that's where MRV and standards are really helpful.
I think you said a magic word, which is claims, which is something I think when you talk about this from a legal perspective comes up a lot. What does that mean for this audience? Like, why do claims matter, and how does that relate to standards in MRV?
Right, so a claim is, what is a claim? A claim is sort of a statement that someone makes that sort of with respect to a certain right or expectation, right? So a claim could be, we are a carbon neutral company, for instance. Well, that's more of a marketing statement, possibly, but if you want to sort of dissect that, you need to come up with a defensible claim that undermines this, that underpins this, right? Especially if you're a listed company and you make these kinds of statements. There are SEC rules out there that you cannot, you need to be truthful in your market disclosures. So, and then if you are a buyer that purchases a credit that turns out to be fake, just use a simple word, you need to have some kind of remedy. You need to have some kind of claim against the entity you purchased it from. And then you have various, and then it can become really tricky, right? Sort of what kind of method was applied to this kind of credit? Is it a nature-based? Is it DAC? What kind of MRV was used? Are there any monitoring obligations to follow up that the project sort of lived up to the expectations after the purchase? That's where DAC, I think, really has an advantage compared to nature-based solutions. I love nature-based solutions, and I'm a big fan of biochar. But in terms of monitoring, there are less standards than in DAC, right? In DAC, there are at least some kind of regulations, Class 6 well regulations. There is some regulatory framework out there in terms of monitoring post-purchase. In nature-based solutions, we don't have that. There are no standards out there, which makes it tricky. So a claim is sort of, and on the buyer side, you need to have a claim that is defensible, and on the supplier side, you also need to have a defensible claim because you want to get financing potentially, right? You want your project to be bankable, so you need to have this kind of reliability and sort of balance of liabilities and claims on both ends for the market to work.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a situation where direct air capture would have a tangible advantage, right? It can tell a much better story around, here's how we know that the climate and atmospheric impacts actually happen, right? Like, you can demonstrate a true net flux out of the atmosphere. And so how do you see this getting integrated in conversations around offtake, right? Like, is this something that buyers are looking for? How does it get valued? Or is this an area where we still need to do more work?
We certainly need to do more work, and it has come up in the previous panel, right, about offtake agreements. We don't really have a widely acknowledged industry standard yet in terms of offtake agreements. That leads to delays in transactions, and I think we can do a better job there. Frontier put out their template last year, which is fairly buyer-friendly. Fair enough, they represent a consortium of buyers, so from their standpoint, that's fine. But there may also be a more supplier-friendly approach to this. Now, in other industries, we have very well-developed templates. I also do a bit of venture capital work for some of our clients when they have financing rounds. For instance, the National Venture Capital Association, they put out templates for seed rounds, Series A financing rounds, Series B financing rounds. When you do in these kinds of, in that kind of scenario, you know exactly how the agreement's going to look like. No one's going to reinvent the wheel. No one has any questions. Sometimes you can even say in the term sheet, we're going to use this kind of model. So everyone knows already before you enter into negotiations, what kind of model agreement is going to be used for this kind of transaction, and then you have a little bits and pieces and details, obviously, that you need to talk about. That's where we need to get to when we're talking about offtake agreements. I've seen horrible examples of offtake agreements. I've seen some good ones. But the crux is that everyone is using a different agreement, and this is incredibly time-consuming and not helpful. a client of mine gets an offtake agreement from a buyer, I never know how this is going to look like. Some of them are fine and it's great. Some of them are really bad. Then it's awful. Some buyers have never done it before, but they view this, their procurement department views it as a standard supply agreement, and then they send you an agreement as if they were buying bolts and pipes. And that's not, and so you need to have an educational element in this entire process, which is time-consuming and frustrating. So we need to have more, I think, a bigger understanding of the importance of offtake agreements and standardizing them. There are many other challenges, obviously, that CDR and DAC have. It's not going to be the silver bullet when we have a nice template that everyone can agree on. And every deal is also going to be a little bit different. Every buyer has a different motivation why they're buying credits. But to have a standard can be extremely helpful, and we are not there yet. And this hinders banks of getting into this market. It prevents insurance companies from entering this market, and every market needs banks and insurances for the market to function. And agreements can play a very important and huge role in developing that kind of confidence for banks and insurances to enter the space.
I think the thing that gets me most excited about this question of liability and how that relates to standards is it's sort of the best way to align incentives, right? Where like, why do people want to buy direct air capture? Why would you spend $1,000 a ton when you can spend $20 a ton on some, avoidance offset? And I think the reason is because you can better demonstrate that the climate impacts are real, right? And so, all of a sudden, like within a liability framework, someone actually cares about getting it right. It matters all of a sudden. And so if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could use that to change something about the political or just operational landscape of this industry to better embed liability across the board, what would you do? What would that look like?
Well, the magic wand would be that we would have I think a compliance market, which we're never going to get, right? At least in the United States, we're not going to get it on a federal level. But what we, and this is not going to, so I'm not going to talk about sort of the magic wand. I think I'm going to talk about sort of the process that I see where we can get to in the next few years. And this will probably be, it could potentially be quite painful, and I think it's going to be quite painful for many companies out there. There will be a consolidation. There are too many companies out there that use different kinds of methodologies, which is incredibly confusing. And it's not going to be helpful to lift the market up. That's what you're working on, sort of to simplify MRV so that they become more transparent for buyers and help them sort of demystify that risk component. So we will need a consolidation in this market and sort of focus on a few lines that will be successful and sort of push them forward on a private level with getting banks and insurance companies involved, but also on a policy level, because we also need regulation that puts reliable guardrails around this.
Amazing. Well, I think we're about out of time, so I just want to say thank you for coming up here and talking us through what is a very complex topic, but I'm also going to throw you under the bus a little bit, and if you all have follow-on questions, come see this guy right here. Thank you all very much.
All right. Thanks.